We will not stop, we will not rest this cause. Divest, we will not stop, we will not rest this cause. When I came home from the spring 2024 semester at San Francisco State University, my Lola was appalled that I participated in the encampment for Palestinian liberation from the Israeli occupation. She had seen stories upon stories, news cycle after news cycle, about how students nationwide were getting arrested, getting attacked, and getting dehumanized by the police and the American government. She asked me, what point is there in fighting for something overseas, something that doesn't even affect us? The truth is, it does affect us, or more so, we, as settlers on this land, affect them. My taxes, your taxes, go to the militaries that commit genocidal actions on our ancestral homelands. They commit atrocities against the children who uphold our future. Why wouldn't I care? My Lola told me that the work I do shouldn't strike me in the heart. I have been an organizer since I was 18, and I have been discreet about everything I do. I am so passionate, so agitated about the state of things, but I've held myself back in the fear of thinking my own actions would directly affect my family. The impetus for becoming an organizer stems from the love for my great Lola. My great Lola, whose words about her struggles during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II inspired me so deeply to the point of wanting to do something. The vivid imagery written in her now sadly lost autobiography was of her eating underground with her 5 children, ants crawling all over them as she starved herself so that her kids could survive with the bits given to them by the Japanese soldiers eager to rid of them in the search for my great Lolo, who led an army against the occupation. It's also the love for an ancestor lost in time, written in bits and pieces, also in my great Lola's autobiography, that led me into organizing. Lorenzo Dañada was his name, hailing from Gumaca City. He prosecuted Japanese soldiers, actively opposed American imperialism under his 24 run as senator, and founded National Democratic Organization Bayan. I have no direct connection to him as of current, but I am in awe of what he's done, and take his words from a message of encouragement to the masses amid a fascist dictatorship under Ferdinand Marcos. Do not and never despair. It is for the masses that the despair I had from my Lola's discouragement of me partaking in organizing spaces does not overwhelm me. It is for my great Lola, Estrella Dañada, and for Lorenzo, for all my ancestors, and the future generations whose lives are laid down in dedication for the revolution, for liberation in the Philippines and worldwide. From Palestine to Congo to Sudan, we will be free from the ties of white supremacy.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
Albeit the fact that I no longer have a hold of my great Lola's words about her life surviving through the Japanese occupation, to consciously deciding what was best for her and her family during and after the Marcos dictatorship, and eventually moving to the imperial core known as America, me alone remembering all of these details from her autobiography is how I maintain to be an organizer despite the pitfalls imposed by capitalism and imperialism. The admiration I see online by the masses in the Philippines who hold a reverence for Lorenzo's work, advocating for the National Democratic Movement, are the words I hold for myself dearly to my heart. It strikes me, knowing that his work is something I'd like to continue as a settler on the lands he opposed, on the lands that currently rot the Philippines today. My great Lola's autobiography by my immediate family was whittled down to a story, something that they didn't necessarily express gratitude for, nor take into their day-to-day life. My immediate family doesn't even acknowledge Lorenzo, and even if they do, they tell me that his work is in the past. It doesn't matter. But it matters so much. In an ethnic studies writing class I took in my first semester at SF State, one of our prompts was, write a letter to your future child or to someone younger than you about what to expect as they grow up in this world. I gave that prompt to several folks who have been active in organizational spaces in Sacramento, a hub that gave me comfort from afar during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic over Zoom. I hope these letters can act as guidance, as future reference towards a future geared in liberation and a life crafted in genuine love and care for years to come. Just as the stories from my great Lola and Lorenzo have kept me going. They're not just stories, but they are words that someone can look back on and remember that we are all in this unified collective fight towards liberation, no matter where we are in life. These words are how we show up, even when we can't physically be there. I had the opportunity to speak with Nell Garcia, someone I met when I was a freshman in college and virtually interned at what was formerly the Carlos Bulasan Center at UC Davis, a space I called home over Zoom. Their upcoming conversation is something that's special. It is a letter of care in itself. From tales about their great-grandparents, to their grandma, to their dad, to their time in undergrad in the Philippines, Nell's letter is built on the utmost of care for and within their community in Sac. I have looked up to Nell for a long, long time, and I am more than happy to have them tell you stories of what was told to them that help them understand the meaning of care and what it means to enact it all around.
I feel like it's safe to say that my dad's stories about people power, for me, invited me to consider that being Filipino had to do with fighting for what's right for the people, because injustice does abound back home. And what's funny is I credit those stories for really inspiring me. And when I moved back to the Philippines in 2014, because I did a couple years of undergrad there, actually after high school, that was the time when Rodrigo Duterte was elected. The Philippine war on drugs really escalated. And that was also when Duterte had Marcos buried in the Libingan ng mga Bayani. And the days leading up to that burial and the day that he did bury him there, because I remember like they did it so sneakily. They like did it at like 4 or 5 in the morning. And so we had this emergency action outside of the university that I was at. When I heard about that happening, I wasn't just thinking in the moment. I was remembering like, oh, this is what my dad told me about. This is the same dictator that, you know, like fundamentally changed the course of the Philippines, and this is what my parents lived through. Of course I'm gonna get out on the street. And I was this lost, like, I think I was a college sophomore or junior at the time. I was lost. I was just trying to, like, go with the flow and fit in with other Filipinos, because my ass was hella American, okay? And so I went out, and I had this one friend who I think was helping organize the emergency walkout, and I remember finding him. And I was like, there you are, like, can I join you? Can I roll with you? And I remember he was like, oh, good, you're here. And he handed me a megaphone. And he was like, can you just take this megaphone and start, like, chanting? Can you, like, go up and down the street? This is on Katipunan Avenue in Quezon City. It's, like, this long, it's just, like, this long street, and we were lining the fence outside the university just all on Katipunan, and I was just like, okay, I guess. So I started walking up and down the street, and that was the first time I ever chant-led. And I remember just being so activated and so, like, convicted and being like, okay, like, I almost felt like I could locate myself in this wider period of time, thinking about what my dad's stories were. And even coming out of my mouth, I do want to say, like, not to minimize what I did, but that was just, like, such a little baby introduction, you know? It's one thing to chant lead. It's one thing to show up at the action and start yelling and getting the crowd hella agitated. It's another thing to be, like, an organizer and roll deep, and that was something that it took me a really long time to learn, and I'm still learning. I left the Philippines shortly after that instance. I think, like, the burial of Marcos was in, like, correct me if I'm wrong, January. And I moved away and moved back to California at the end of February. And I took a leave of absence from my studies because of my mental health, and I decided to kind of just, like, go back home, be with my parents, and I got some treatment here in the U.S., but I felt so split even after I decided to stay behind in California, because, like, I was physically here, but mentally I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening back in the Philippines. Because for me, like, just the whole experience of being there in Manila, and I do have to say, like, I was relatively safe. I was more or less guaranteed to be safe. I was a upper middle class, return migrant, studying at one of the most elite universities in the Philippines. It would be remiss and inauthentic for me to be like, oh, I feared for my life, you know? But watching this climate of violence unfold in front of me, while I, as a naive and sheltered young American-raised Filipino, was something that, like, to this day, I'm still trying to find words for and make sense out of. I remember, like, during the height, well, I mean, it's still going on, right? But during the height of what I consider to be, like, my awareness and involvement in, you know, like, trying to be aware of what was going on in the drug war, like, I would just constantly see online, on Facebook, and on my social media feeds, it was just pictures of body after body after body. You know, it kind of reminds me right now of, like, you know, what we're seeing coming out of Gaza and Palestine. I couldn't divorce my personal sense of Filipino-ness from what was unfolding around me. Being in the Philippines at that time and watching all of that happen, it made me really try to consider, like, what is our responsibility in the diaspora? And I wasn't aware of, you know, like, the fact that there were Philams organizing against Marcos in the 80s. I didn't know that. I feel like organizing, especially, like, as a middle-class Filipino, is not just, like, a responsibility to our diasporic community, but Filipino Americans in general. We're in such a unique position and location, being in the former colonial power. Holding all of the things that happen within our community, like, holding that true, while also understanding that just by virtue of being in the United States, we are complicit in the funding of activist killings, complicit in the very killings that were happening when I was first getting awakened. If I had the language I have now, back then, I think what really I wanted to say was really just the fact that I was like, yo, we are not disconnected from this. The Philippine National Police was responsible for so many of these murders. And our tax dollars as U.S. citizens is what is paying for that, is what is paying for what is happening in Gaza, is what's paying for so much violence all over the world. And so when I say, like, it is an obligation and it is a responsibility for us, it's just this other layer of our connectedness to each other, not just within our community because we are from the same homeland and certain forces have interacted to bring us here, even if it's a different experience. There's another layer to that of, like, we as people in the United States inherently have a responsibility to make this stop. I just think about the intertwined histories of the Philippines, the US, of Palestine. And at the end of the day, it's just we are trying to just create a world where everyone is cared for and everyone is not facing violence, whether that is violence from an occupying force or violence from the state, like the state itself trying to repress indigenous movements, or the violence of poverty, or the violence of a terrible immigration system. You know, like, it's the root of it is care, and the root of it is us being like again, like, to come back to this image of just, like, standing together and seeing the same thing and being upset about it. It's like we are angry because we want people to have better. And I think that's something that as people try to paint activism and resistance as some inherently violent thing springing out of nowhere, but anger and hatred, people have to care. People get angry when the people that they love are hurt. Rightfully so. This all comes from an understanding that we are not being cared for. Whether it's in our local community or in the diaspora or peoples oppressed worldwide. I can't help but think about, like, how much did my grandma have to walk by that she had to make sure didn't let her heart be struck? Like, to think about, like, you know, like The Last of Us, like the TV show, where they're driving and there's a guy and he's like, hey, can you help me? And Pedro Pascal's like, I'm not gonna trust that. I know he's gonna rob me. Like, I think about that and I'm like, dang, like, I'm sure stuff like that happened when my grandmother and my grandfather were my age, living through occupation. And so what does it mean for us to hold that and try to choose something different? Because we have the opportunity to make something different. I'm sure if there was some grassroots network of care or whatever that looked like, you know, like, I'm sure if that was an option for them, they might have. But how do we, you know, I'm like, how do we let that understanding of what our ancestors went through, of what my grandmother went through, when she'll randomly tell me one day, oh, when I was 16, in the middle of the night, I had to hop out the window because I was scared that a soldier was gonna rape me, and then, like, carry on with her day. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, I think about that a lot. And I'm like, for my girlhood to be so vastly different from that random bit of lore that she dropped, that if she's gonna randomly drop it, I'm sure she hasn't processed yet. I want to be able to let those things inform me just as much as, you know, also, like, the big ideas. We all carry those stories within us. Not just, like, the trauma of it all, but we also carry that, well, I mean, like, yeah, I guess, like, we carry that story of trauma within us, but beyond that, it's a story of survival, right? So, like, maybe this sounds a little woo-woo, but I like to think if our ancestors were able to survive such violence, if we were able to have the faith that because they survived, we will survive too, and that took away that mental block, what could we accomplish? You know? How do we care for each other? How do we make it through? And I think this is something that I wanted to touch on as well. Organizing and activism, yes, it is the rallies, it is the mobilizing, it is the recruiting, it is the Google Docs and the late night meetings. But it's also the little bits of care that we practice among each other. It's us feeding our kasamas or being fed by our kasamas when our paycheck hasn't come yet. It's us giving rides to each other when we don't have a car, because God knows car payments are ridiculous nowadays. And these are examples that I give credit to my own kasamas for. It's those little practices that also help us get by. And so many people leave the movement because surviving in this system under white supremacy, under capitalism, under surveillance, having to feed our children and just getting by. So many people leave the movement because it's hard to commit under those conditions. And so, like, for me, I think it's so important that we as an organizing community, especially those of us working with, like the youth who are still trying to make sense of, how do I be this activist? Do I have to wear the right garb? And do I have to be the most agit and know the most theory? It's about how we show up for each other. And we can learn everything bottom up from there, And I think that was something that had kept me also from... I was hesitant to join some organizing spaces before because I was scared of getting canceled. I was scared of not being the most down or not knowing what the second rectification was and not being able to quote PSR. And I think that a lot of people go through that stage, understandably, because we have racial anxiety as Filipinos, and that's one vehicle that people, I think, perform Filipino-ness. But the kasamas who have really shown me that radical love and that radical care, they're the ones who have put that to the forefront and really teach me, how do we be patient, and how do we have those hard conversations, and how do we walk our walk in our micro interactions, not just at the intersection where we're marching up and down. And I think that is more imperative now more than ever in this current political moment, because regardless of who is in charge or what is happening out there, the community, like what matters is, how are we creating things outside of these systems? If one is of the import that, maybe we have to consider harm reduction at the national level, okay? What will we do, though, for the things outside of the system? Yeah, it's those sort of things. It's centering care and centering how we show up for each other. That's what keeps people coming back, and that's what keeps people staying. And I think, that's something that Robin taught me a long time ago, that, when you were like, oh, what would you want, the youth to know? And I'm like, honestly, I still feel like the youth at my age, even though I know I'm not. I think if people come into the space already knowing that, what more, how much farther can we go? And I think, honestly, though, the youth have it down. So many of them that I see, online, being so kind to each other and answering each other's questions and, being so supportive, shit, I didn't have that growing up. And I love that I'm seeing, in my experience, seeing youth take that more organic approach and having patience with each other. And I wonder if that comes from just, knowing your whole life that this world is inevitably gonna change. And that's something that gives me hope, is watching how they move, because they know they have nothing to lose. So it's I'm honestly I don't know what I'm gonna tell the youth. I want the youth to tell me what to do at this point. You know what I mean? I learned a year ago when I went to the Philippines. I went for my grandmother's funeral, and I went to my auntie's house, and she had a collection of books that my these self-published autobiographies that my great-grandfather wrote. So that's my grandma who had died. It's her dad. He had written an autobiography. And I learned from his writing and also my grandmother's writing, because my grandmother was so dedicated to collecting the stories of people in her hometown and of her family. I learned through those books that my great-grandfather was wrongfully imprisoned during World War II. And what had happened there, according to him, I can't ask him, he's with Creator now, but according to his narrative, he was stationed, I think he was a member of, the army, and he was stationed at a base, but there was a specific day where he asked for leave because my great-grandmother was pregnant and was having a really difficult time. So he left that day. And the day that he was gone, some guerrilla units of the Philippine army who believed that, who believed that the military and the government were not doing enough to protect their specific provinces from the occupation. They broke away, formed guerrilla units, and raided the base that my grandfather was stationed at for weapons. My great-grandfather calls the people who punished him the, quote, pseudo-nationalist elite, which is, I think he was more radical than I was told he was, reading that back. But because they wanted a scapegoat, and I don't know if it was like the military officers or people in government, but whoever was in charge wanted a scapegoat and wanted to have this under control, because the people who had raided were saying, like, yo, y'all don't know how to take care of us. And instead of responding and taking care and taking action, they threw my great-grandfather in jail, even though he was out that day, because they had nothing else to do to show control. I don't know how long he was imprisoned for, but according to what my grandmother wrote and my great-grandfather wrote, every week, his wife and his mother-in-law would show up and tell him stories and listen to him and bring him food. And those are, like, such simple things, But even when I think about, like, my great-great-grandmother, like, his mother-in-law accompanying his wife to support her, to bring, like, what is that like? Like, I can't imagine going through that. And this is a story that I don't even know all of the details of. What more, if you go back bloodlines, what were the things that people did day in, day out to help make it just a little bit less miserable, a little bit easier? Bringing food, coming to just, like, talk, to have a familiar face, braving the soldiers who are harassing you while you're trying to talk to your husband, who shouldn't even be in there, and is in there because of the failure of the elite to really listen to the people. There are big forces at play, but to me, I think about what did my great-great-grandmother cook for him? What are the stories that he told him? And while I don't think I'll ever know that, I think a lot about how those through lines of care and feeding each other, like these basic needs, giving each other company, that is something that is so indispensable, and I hope doesn't get lost as we try to expand and recruit more and build more, because that is so necessary, Fuck. And I think about how my grandmother, like, when she passed away, so many people were talking about how her house was the place where we all could come together and we could all feel community. And they were talking about her cooking and how she loved to tell stories. And I think about her own father, who was cooked for and was kept alive partially through stories and food. It's just like these little connections that I don't have the words for, but you see it. And those are the things that we inherit. And if we're going to organize for the people, like, how do we bring that to the table? How do we bring our ancestors' practices to the table? It's those little things and the way that we show up for each other and document that. And that's something that I think informs me as I move into this new phase of life.
After speaking to Nell, I wanted to rewrite the precursor to this podcast, but I decided not to, out of transparency, to let everyone know how clear my feelings were about my family, about everyone else, before writing this podcast. I felt agitated a lot about the state of things in my life. But that can always change as we progress over time and understand our lessons and understand our own material conditions. My littlest discouragement of me participating in the encampment came from a place of worry. Because in the end, despite her telling me not to let it strike me in the heart, I knew that me caring for the masses struck her in her own heart. She watched people on the streets at the universities where her sister worked at revolutionize against Marcos. She was only stopped by her family in participating because they were also worried about her. That alone is a cycle of care put through actions and words that you, me, we can take as our own today. I chose to speak to Yi Tao in this next portion, who was kind to write the letter that encompasses the theme for this podcast, Letters for Liberation. Yi graduated from Sacramento State University in Asian American Studies and is now pursuing her master's at UCLA. When speaking to Yi, their love for the Hmong community and what it means to truly even have a community struck me. It helped me comprehend what liberation looks like for all of us as we join together in the struggle not only to win against capitalism, imperialism, militarism, all of the isms that plague us, but to know one another, how to ultimately care, and how that can liberate us and the future generations to come.
I can share a bit about my organizing journey and how it started. I started, I think, at like a really pivotal point of my life when I was transitioning out of a youth and I was becoming a young adult from like 17 to 18. And I joined an organization called Hmong Innovating Politics, and I'm still a part of their organization even now. Simply because I think that being a part of these spaces really keeps me grounded and also just feel like I'm not disconnected overall. I think it was really tough, like transitioning from like the summer of me being 18 to in-person college, because I started college online, and going into an environment where I was surrounded by college students who weren't really in these like political conversations, right? And like didn't want to partake in things that involve social justice or anything around that parameter, right? It was really difficult to like go into that because I'm like, oh dang, how do I navigate these conversations? But I think like leaving that space, it really taught me to like not stereotype and generalize the community that I was trying to uplift as well. Initially I went in and a lot of the contentions I felt was that like, oh, like what does it mean to mobilize and help liberate a community where I also feel disempowered in as like a Hmong woman, and so like what are the power and social dynamics there, right, that exist. And so I think I was like really entering these spaces with like a black or white mindset about, oh, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. And although I think like to a certain extent there was a lot of things that I think I was rightfully reactionary, but there are different approaches to how we can meet community where they're at. And as I'm like dwelling in different conversations too, I'm now learning that I think oftentimes when we speak of community, we talk about like an imaginary community, and I think the idea of it is always nice, but to actually be a part of change making. It's really tough. It's difficult to like change the hearts and minds of people, especially when everything that surrounds them is these systems of power and oppression, the media that they consume, the conversations that they have, things that are normalized around them. And when I'm introducing these new things, it's really difficult. And so I really had to come to terms with for myself, and also reconcile with the fact that a lot of these conversations too wasn't a reflection of myself per se, but it was a reflection of the larger community. And that's okay. It's okay to like be a part of transformation and growth and change. But that it's gonna come with a lot of layers, and it's gonna be tough. But also giving myself like the leniency and self-affirmations that when I am like introducing these conversations to different spaces, it's important to be mindful of how people are feeling as well. I think when I'm coming in with the mindset of like, oh, this is what's strictly right and this is what's strictly wrong, it's easy to miss like a blurry line of like what humanizes others. And what I've learned from people is that, you know, when you treat other people like human, they're also more likely to treat you like human as well. And so, yeah, and thankfully I've had like really great mentors in the community org that I worked at who has really taught me to like reframe what radical care, and also like resilience means and looks like. And also that like oftentimes it's not just like, oh, us versus them. Sometimes what collective liberation really means and looks like, and what the word community means, is that, you know, there's going to be people who don't align with you 100% all the time on everything, but that it's the action of coming together and investing in networks of care and growth, and simply on that basis that we're humans and we're people, like that's what community should be. And that like I'm now learning too that friendships are also differing from community, and that I have different expectations for like those different sorts of relationships. And it's important to like know what a healthy distance is, know what healthy attachment is as well, especially for like community. And and I think like the danger of like having a very like rose-lensed idea of community is that not everyone who comes into these spaces are going to exactly come from the same background as you do. And overall, I think that like even in like the conversations that I'm in right now, oftentimes what I feel really frustrated with is like a hyper focus on the identity politics of things, I think at times, which I think really strays us away from this idea of collective liberation, that like, oh, you know, because you have X, Y, and Z privileged identities, therefore I can't resonate with you, which is like, that's true and fair, right? But I also think that excluding people from conversations that are necessary for change also doesn't contribute to the healing and wellness that we need as like an entire community. And community in this sense is like, you know, understanding that liberation is applied to all, and that we're not all liberated if one group is not, right? And so for me, I think like I'm just still like grappling with that and like trying to find the balance of like, oh, like that's really, it's difficult. I think that like for us, every single time we come into these spaces, it will be that we come with different privileges and identities, and that's something that we have to meet in the middle with. And you know, I think that like this also can be like misinterpreted to be that, oh, this means that we can't hold people accountable for abusing their privilege. But for me, like that's not what I'm saying. I think that we can definitely still hold folks accountable for causing harm, but understanding through transformative justice, for example, and also healing justice, that we experience harm, but we also cause harm. So what does it mean to be a part of a community where all of these things are intermixed, right? They're not exactly cutthroat, like separated. I was investing in a lot of effort to try to find like a new political home in SoCal. But one, I think that like overall, like in the Central Valley and in NorCal, the organizing is like relatively newer, rather in comparison to like the Bay Area and SoCal. Putting that context into place, I think that there's a lot of differences. Like one, there's more pre-established organizations in SoCal where they're older, they've been around for like 30, 40 years, and therefore they have like older organizers. And I think what I've experienced so far is that like their mode of organizing is really different from like our current generation, which is like an expected change, right? And in our movement. But I also think that at times the concepts that we're introducing now about like care for ourselves and in reflection care for our community is embodied very differently. And I also think that like sometimes I encounter like older organizers who aren't as receptive to feedback and whatnot. And obviously this is all like with exception and like my own experiences. There's also like plenty of old organizers who I've met who are wonderful and support like folks in their innovation in terms of like new forms and ways of organizing and ways to like contend and strategize with like the world that we're currently living in moving forward. But yeah, I think that the concept of care is just so like intricate and interesting too. But how this translates into like my master's thesis at UCLA is that I think for us, I think for Hmong people in particular, it's a very interesting historical and geopolitical context that we don't necessarily have a homeland in that sense. Because, for example, when I ask my parents where their homeland is, they say Laos because it is their birthplace, but they usually say it with a lot of hesitancy, doubts, and pauses, unsure to say if it's exactly accurate and indicative of their ancestors' legacies. However, after reflecting on their persecution and their forced migration, exile, and marginalization their entire lives, they tell me that they have no place to call home exactly. And you would think that since I am born and raised in America, I would feel a stronger affiliation to US roots and have an easier answer to this question. Yet, I also stop to think when people ask me where I am from, and I'm like, oh yeah, we don't exactly have a homeland because our entire history has been one where in every country that we reside in, we are an ethnic minority group. And therefore, what does it mean to mobilize and try to liberate a diasporic community that doesn't have connections to a land, per se? And I've also learned that among Americans in the context of U.S. empire also do not consider the U.S. their homeland, for I think a homeland entails agency and autonomy over their personhood and sense of comfort and empowerment. But for that, you know, for example, like the Philippines, like that, the idea of a homeland, it doesn't even encompass that because of the authoritative rule that they're under. And so, yeah, and so I think a lot about like what does Hmong community organizing and liberation look like without a geopolitical center, and why is it that these things exist, right? But I think that like overall, like despite existing in diaspora without a geopolitical center, Hmong history has been imbued by community solidarity and resilience, attributing to their resistance against these different forms of colonization, imperialism, and militarized processes. And I think that specifically for Hmong people, though, a non-existent geopolitical center doesn't imply, though, that there is a desire or a necessity to gain geopolitical power in order to proceed or receive or to gain liberation. I think that like overall, I think that it doesn't necessitate for a colonial occupation of land per se. which I think is like a very interesting context to put Hmong folks in, that like there's not necessarily a land attribute to that, and that like the concept of home is very fluid and it's about claiming space and taking up space, but what does that mean now within the context of the US? But that whole spiel was just meant to say that like that a lot of those contentions for myself when I was like just became a young adult at 18, I had a lot of questions surrounding that, about like the idea of home for Hmong people. What does it mean to really exist as like people that are considered countryless? And I've also asked my mom this as well, and she gave me such a sassy, cute response. She's just like, well, actually, like everyone who has come to America is also nationless, because like there's original peoples who lived here, and she also considers white people nationless because they have also, like settled and colonized these lands. And so, yeah, I think that like it's an interesting concept. So in my creative thesis that I'm producing for my MA, I am talking about like Hmong historical events such as like the migration patterns, what does refugeehood mean, what are meanings of home, and specifically I'm looking at what Hmong femme praxis entails, because for the Hmong community organizing movement, it is primarily led by Hmong women and queer folks. So it is like you rarely see any cis-het men in these spaces, Hmong men in these spaces. And so I'm currently documenting what first generation Hmong femme leaders who are actively building political and social mobilization movements are doing, and that's like what my entire project is. It's a mixed capstone / thesis project, and I think specifically my research is focusing on like utilizing gendered refugee migration frameworks to investigate what Hmong femme leadership in Sacramento community organizing spaces look like. But not just in Sacramento, because HIP also branches out to the Central Valley and in Fresno. So I'm kind of investigating both Sacramento and Fresno and documenting it. And in this, I'm defining gendered refugee migration as a framework and a process in which forced migration processes and experiences are shaped by and continue to reshape gendered notions around Hmong refugee communities as it intersects with race, class, and sexuality. And I'm trying to really push forward this idea of like dismantling leadership and the concept of it, that leadership has been historically gendered to be masculine, but I'm redefining through evidence of Hmong femme leadership in community organizing movements that gendered leadership, as it has been reified and shifted through transnational migration, that it's also feminine. What is gender? What is refugee? What is migration in the Hmong diaspora separately? And when that comes together, what does that mean? But I also acknowledge in this that like my research analysis of gendered leadership and migration is very limited to a cis-het interpretation of it, as I draw from my own narratives as someone who doesn't identify as queer. And so, but I think that although my research is narrow and focused, the significance of Hmong queer leadership is definitely deeply embedded and felt in Hmong community organizing efforts. And I'm specifically producing this in the form of a film documentary because I think Hmong women in Hmong produced media often undergo processes of sexualization and objectification. A very distinct contemporary example is of like Hmong New Year's videos on YouTube today. Mostly every video includes like scene after scene of Hmong women as subjects to the male gaze. And so through my thesis, I'm really hoping to disrupt, dismantle, and reclaim these images of Hmong feminized resistance and existence. And I also want to tangibly give back to my community by documenting and utilizing media as a tool for disruption. And I think that like there's also like a lot of cultural context that has really fueled and inspired this project for me, that Because Hmong folks don't have written scriptures, we focus a lot on, and have always existed through, oral history practices and memory storytelling. But that has also been traditionally produced by patriarchal forms, right, of like expressing memory and also storytelling. And so what does it mean to disrupt this traditional subject formation for Hmong women, and also emphasize the Hmong feminized labor that has always existed throughout history, which includes things like the Hmong story cloth, for example, and which is like, a Hmong story cloth is sewn by Hmong women, and which is an exact symbol and reflection that the preservation of Hmong historical memory has always been sewn, created, and sustained by women, and that it is a part of their feminized praxis to be creators and to be leaders of homemaking. And I also think there's a deceiving connotation around the importance of homemaking that is gendered to be feminized and therefore inherently weak and unresourceful, but that homemaking is something that has proven to be extraordinarily significant to the Hmong diaspora today. So there's a lot of like different things there. I'm like in the process, the beginning part of my research only, and so I don't have like solidified pieces of that yet, and I'm still undergoing the interviews as well. But those are like my pre-existing ideas, and I actually just had a meeting with like my interviewees this afternoon, and it was really nice. I think I feel really like confident moving forward, just because I think just their narrative standalone already is so powerful, and I think that their experiences leading up to this point has really informed the way in which they shape and create these spaces for community, which I think is like really precious. And I think we think a lot about the future as well. It has been a thought in my head recently about like what does the future generation of organizing look like? And I'm trying to think right now about like the younger Hmong folks who no longer have like a first gen experience of like the refugee migration experience. I'm learning to also reconcile with the fact that like change is supposed to happen with the future generations, and that because we're trying to build better conditions for our younger folks, it makes sense that like their leadership will look different. Yeah, and I'm also like trying to use the word leadership very loosely as well, because I think like I think sometimes there's like power connotations around the word leadership and also being a leader and what that means. And it doesn't imply like collaboration, I feel sometimes. I think home to me is I think it's a very like complex concept that transcends a traditional notion of like a physical dwelling or a land. Once again, like given the context that Hmong people cannot legally claim any land as their own, so I think it encompasses not only a geographical place but also the emotional, cultural, and social connections maintained across borders and generations. That for Hmong diasporic communities, home is this nostalgic longing for the land that they and their ancestors left behind, which is imbued in memories and traditions and a sense of belonging. But this also manifests into the diaspora itself, where individuals create new spaces for belonging and community, as we are seeing through community organizing spaces, where that in itself is a space to come together, where we talk about what collective identity formation means and looks like. What does it mean to keep on hoping and dreaming? And I think that's what I really learned throughout my organizing, is that before entering these spaces and conversations, I think sometimes I'm often accused of like being too idealistic, or like, oh, you're too like hopeful, like, you know, there will always be a world of injustice, yada yada yada. But I think that every time I go back to any sort of like community organizing space, I become re-inspired that these spaces that we're dreaming up and the spaces that we are building, creating right now is the first time that we're seeing it in history, you know? And so I think that, and even if there were reiterations of it in the past, I think how we're doing it right now is very special and unique, and it will continue to be that way for the future too. And it's important to not stop dreaming about like what liberation can be and looks like. And it's important to think outside of the box and to reimagine and to think of all these like really, really big dreams, even if they seem to other folks, you know, like unattainable and whatnot. Because like the freedom and resistance that has persisted over generations previously has also felt and seemed unattainable, but they were attained. And so I think like a lot of these things a lot of people remind me that places and spaces can attribute to the word home, and that sometimes our representations and ideas of home don't have to be siloed or exist in just what like white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalistic interpretations make it out to be. This stuff is tough, like simple as that. I think that I forget that like honestly there's only 20% probably. I'm like pulling this number out of nowhere, but in my head there's like 20% of people of like a general population group that would be involved in these conversations rooted in care, rooted in dismantling systems of oppression and power. But I forget that the majority of people, like the 80% that we encounter on a daily basis, they're not involved in these conversations, and frankly a lot of them don't care. And so when I think about care in that sense, like I think I've always had to over explain to people why I care. Like they're like, oh well, why do you care so much about these communities that don't affect you or these problems that don't affect you? I'm like, well, first of all, that's the definition of privilege. But also second off, I'm like, I don't know how to explain to you like why I care about, you know, issues that don't necessarily directly impact my daily life. But now I think I do have the words to explain that, well, it's because we're interconnected, and all of our problems, one way or another, the freedom of another group is also directly dependent on us and vice versa. Yeah, and so I think what I was trying to say is that I think I would have wished to hear just that, like, there's a large majority of people who are not going to immediately resonate with, like, quote-unquote, like, radical ideas that you bring to the table, but you're needing to learn how to strategize, how to like lead conversations and make sense to people who are like in this middle ground. I forgot what they call it. They call it like, there's like this chart that talks about like naysayers and then also like middle ground people and the people who are already on your side. But then like essentially what it's trying to say is that, oh, like the people who are already very, very much against you and your stance, like there's not really a large point in investing care and efforts into having conversations with them. But instead you should have conversations with people who are in this middle ground, who don't exactly have a stance but are open to conversation and dialogue, and that when we invest efforts in that way, it's easier to sustain the movement and ourselves. So it's like if I was in a room full of like people who I already know have an opposite viewpoint, then like there's not necessarily a point to like put myself in a position where I'm gonna risk my safety and like other members of my groups and their safety. And I think like that kind of viewpoint oftentimes goes against like this stereotypical image of what an activist is. It's like, oh, you gotta stand up even when you like even if you're the only one standing up. And I totally understand and get that too, and I think that there's also value and power in that, but I think that's like also a difference between like an activist and an organizer, is that like I think multiple folks have shared this too, but I think anyone can be an activist, but to be an organizer and to think about strategizing for a long-term movement, that's a lot more commitment, and also thinking about how critiquing these systems is not enough. Like, we also have to do like the healing and the wellness work afterwards. We have to think about the sustainability of the movement and our people afterwards. But just addressing and critiquing the system in the moment, while it has a lot of power and value, it's not enough to continue this work of liberation. Maybe we have inherited the generational grief of our Hmong ancestors and a legacy of persecution. Maybe we are bound by the feelings of non-belonging and outsiderhood. Maybe we are wrong for coveting the possession of places that cannot belong to us. Maybe it's the feeling of the unfamiliar non-tropical climate, or the way in which we are harvesting life so differently. Maybe it's the internalization of our history's unresponsiveness and silence that is prompting this violence. Or maybe these internal conflicts are externally driven. Maybe home is a boundlessly intangible, abstract, and changing concept. Maybe we need to revisit the strength and resilience of our foremothers and ancestors. Maybe our parents' foreign-born labor was forcibly conceived, and our American-born self misconceived it. Maybe their spiritual designation has brought them to us so they can retell their mythified and intentionally diluted silence and conditions they have been forcibly placed in, and reteach it in a way that is empowering and true to them. Maybe we are a vessel of creation, knowledge, and power. Maybe we are the advent of transformation, rightfully reactionary so, planting the seeds for insurgents, and resewing the clothes that have been outworn but have kept us warm and alive for so long. It is the way oppressors ask us, why are we searching for water when we are surrounded by an ocean? Blind to the truth that this vastness, though ever present, is unquenchable. Its waters salted with the tears of our ancestors, too bitter to heal the wounds that we carry. And I have come to realize that care is more than just mere survival. It is the cultivation of life in places where death was imposed to take root. And I once believed I was lost, drifting endlessly in search of a home which maybe never was, having nostalgia for places that we cannot return to, and hearing the echoes of the lost places of our souls past and our grief for them. Yet now I see that home never was a destination, but a tapestry woven into the language of our mother tongue, in the rich soil of memory where our parents' stories grow, in the lines of my skin and forehead when it furrows. Home is in the curve of my brow and the bridge of my nose that carries the weight of history and the hope of tomorrow. Home is not a single place, nor just a tragedy of erasure, but a living creation, a space where we carve with our hands and hearts, where we make ourselves whole. And that we are not merely seeking a place to just belong, but that we are the architects of our own belonging, the creators of worlds where we can be free and liberated. And there is a power that pulses underneath the surface of our skin, a force that moves like rivers through the veins of our collective body. It is the power of people, of hands that have labored and lifted voices. And we know that this power is not given. It is born from the fire in our bellies, from the dreams that refused to be silenced. People power is the strength of many woven into one, a tapestry of resistance and resilience that no oppressor can tear apart. It is the light in our eyes when we see each other as we truly are, bound not by chains, but by the unbreakable thread of our shared humanity. Together, we are the storm that shakes the foundations, the roots that crack the concrete, the seeds that will bloom into forests where freedom grows wild and uncontained. This is our power, not in the hands of a few, but in the hearts of the many. And it's a force that can move mountains and emerge change for the future.